February 8, 1943. Imphal, on the India-Burma border, no tanks crossed that morning. No artillery barrage opened the way. Just under 3,000 men walked out of Allied-held India and into Japanese-occupied Burma on foot, leading mules loaded with radios, ammunition, and just enough rice to survive until the next airdrop. Because there was no other way to resupply them. No road followed them in. No road would come out to meet them when it was over. Whatever happened to these men over the next 3 months, they would have to walk their way through it, one river and one mountain range at a time. They called themselves the Chindits, a deliberately mangled version of Chinth, or the mythical lion-griffin statues that guard Burmese temples. It was a fitting name for a unit that barely existed on paper 8 months earlier, and that most of the British High Command in India still weren't sure should exist at all. To understand why an idea this fragile would end up rattling not just Imperial Japan but the entire architecture of Axis military confidence in Asia, you have to understand the man who built it, and the year that came before this walk began. By early 1942, the war in the Pacific and Southeast Asia had gone almost entirely one way. Japan, bound to Germany and Italy since September 1940 under the Tripartite Pact, making it a full third of the Axis alliance rather than a separate war, had taken Hong Kong within weeks of Pearl Harbor. Singapore, supposedly Britain's impregnable Asian fortress, surrendered on February 15, 1942, in what Winston Churchill himself called the worst disaster in British military history. Burma fell next, and by May 1942, the British Empire's entire position east of India had effectively collapsed. Japanese forces had beaten British, American, Dutch, and Australian troops in every major engagement across the region for 5 straight months. That's the year this story starts inside. Total Axis momentum, total Allied retreat, and into that collapse walked a British officer most of his own colleagues found genuinely difficult to work with. Brigadier Orde Wingate. Wingate wasn't a Burma specialist. He'd made his name running irregular guerrilla operations in Palestine in the late 1930s, and again in Ethiopia in 1941, helping restore Emperor Haile Selassie to his throne with a force a fraction the size of the Italian army occupying the country. General Archibald Wavell, who'd worked with Wingate before, brought him to India in March 1942 with a simple, almost reckless proposition. Could small columns of trained soldiers survive and fight for extended periods deep inside Japanese-held territory, resupplied entirely by air, with no fixed base and no line of retreat? Nobody in the British Army had tried this at this scale before. I tell you what happened when Wingate's theory met the Imperial Japanese Army for the first time. Because what happened over the following weeks became something Japanese command itself would later admit disrupted an entire offensive. I want to hear from you directly. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from, and whether anyone in your family served in it. This channel exists because people keep sharing those stories in the comments, and I read every one of them. Wingate spent the second half of 1942 turning that theory into the 77th Indian Infantry Brigade, training men, British, Gurkha, and Burmese soldiers together, to march under impossible loads through terrain the British Army had, until that point, simply written off as untraversable. Officers who fell during training marches were revived and made to keep walking. Sickness and minor injury were treated, in Wingate's own words to his men, as secondary to willpower. It was brutal by design because Wingate believed, and would soon prove, that the jungle, not just the Japanese, was the real enemy his men had to be trained to survive. On the morning they finally moved out, Wingate addressed his brigade with a speech that has survived in multiple first-hand accounts. He told them, "Today we stand on the threshold of battle. The time for preparation is over, and we are moving on the enemy to prove ourselves and our methods." 5 days later, on February 13, 1943, they crossed the Chindwin River into Japanese territory. 2 days after that, February 15, 1943, this untested, unproven, half-doubted idea made contact with Imperial Japanese soldiers for the very first time. What the Japanese command discovered in the weeks that followed wasn't a battle they lost outright. It was something stranger, and in some ways more damaging to their planning than a lost battle would have been. February 15, 1943. The east bank of the Chindit River, Burma. 2 days after crossing into Japanese-held territory, the Chindits made contact with Imperial Japanese troops for the first time. It wasn't the clean, decisive battle either side might have expected. It was scattered, confusing, and small. Patrol against patrol, ambush against ambush, and that confusion turned out to be exactly the point. Wingate's brigade wasn't organized to hold ground or fight a set-piece battle. It was organized into 8 independent columns of roughly 300 to 400 men each, built to move fast, strike, and vanish before the Japanese could concentrate force against them. For an army that had spent the previous 14 months winning by speed and aggression across Malaya, Singapore, and Burma, for this was the first time in the entire Southeast Asian campaign that Japanese commanders were forced to react to someone else's timing instead of setting their own. By March 1943, 4 of the 8 columns had pushed deep behind Japanese lines and begun doing exactly what they'd been sent to do, cutting the railway lines that fed Japanese forces in northern Burma. On March 6, Chindit demolition teams blew multiple sections of the Mandalay-Myitkyina Railway. On March 23, Columns 7 and 8 fought a single engagement that would later be cited as proof the concept worked. 219 Japanese soldiers killed, against 2 Chindits dead and 17 wounded. Major Michael Calvert's No. 3 column pushed even further, launching a raid that dropped the Goktik Gorge Viaduct, a critical rail structure roughly 60 miles north of Mandalay. Cutting a supply artery the Japanese had assumed was safe, simply because no one had ever reached it before. But here's the number that actually rattled Japanese command, though, and it isn't a body count. It's a diversion figure. To hunt down 3,000 lightly armed men with no fixed base, no armor, and no supply road, the Japanese were forced to commit roughly 3 full divisions. Tens of thousands of troops, pulled away from frontline duty specifically to chase an enemy that refused to stand and fight where it could be found. Lieutenant General Renya Mutaguchi, the Japanese commander in the region, had to alter his entire operational planning for the rest of 1943 because of a brigade smaller than a single one of his divisions. But the cost to the Chindits themselves was severe, and any honest account of this story has to sit with that. By late March, the columns were operating at the extreme edge of their air supply range. Water was scarce. Malaria and dysentery were spreading through men who'd already marched hundreds of miles on short rations. On March 24, 1943, Wingate gave the order every long-range penetration unit dreads. Disperse and withdraw, every column for itself. Back across the Chindit and Irrawaddy rivers. They'd already crossed once going the other direction. The retreat became the worst part of the entire operation. Japanese patrols now knew roughly where the Chindits would try to cross, and they waited. On April 10, 1943, at the Shweli River, around 50 men of No. 5 column were captured after failing to swim the final 80 yards to the eastern shore, the single largest group of Chindits taken prisoner during the entire expedition. Wounded men who couldn't keep pace were, in the grimmest moments of the campaign, left behind with what food, water, and morphine their comrades could spare, because there was no aircraft that could land in that jungle to carry them out. Lieutenant Ian McHaunton of No. 2 column, left behind in exactly this way, wrote afterward about the moment his column's sounds finally faded out of earshot. My utter loneliness engulfed me. Of the roughly 3,000 men who marched into Burma in February, close to 1,000 didn't make it back. Of the 182, who did return by the end of April 1943, only around 600 were fit to fight again. William Slim, the British general who would later command the entire 14th Army in Burma, wrote in his post-war memoir Defeat into Victory that as a military operation, Longcloth had been an expensive failure. By any conventional scorecard, territory taken, casualties inflicted versus casualties suffered, the Japanese could have called this a win. And for a while, some of their own commanders did. What changed their minds wasn't what happened during Operation Longcloth, for it was what Japanese command decided to do about it 12 months later, a decision that would turn out to be one of the costliest strategic miscalculations of the entire Pacific War, January 7, 1944. Imperial General Headquarters, Tokyo, Lieutenant General Renya Mutaguchi got what he'd been pushing for since the moment he took command of Japan's 15th Army the previous March: formal approval to invade India. The operation was codenamed Yugo. The target was two British staging towns just across the mountains from Burma, Imphal and Kohima. If Mutaguchi could take them, he believed he could threaten Delhi itself, trigger a nationwide uprising against British colonial rule, and hand Japan the single decisive victory it desperately needed after a year of losses across the Pacific. Here is the detail historians keep coming back to, and it's the real answer to why this title says, "The Axis feared the Chindits." Mutaguchi's own confidence that this invasion was even possible traced directly back to what he'd watched Wingate's men do to him 11 months earlier. In the spring of 1943, while commanding the Japanese 18th Division in northern Burma, Mutaguchi had publicly insisted the jungle terrain north of his lines was impassable to any organized military force. Wingate's Chindits crossed it anyway, on foot, with mules, and disappeared into it for 3 months. As one wartime intelligence assessment of Japanese command thinking later summarized it, for the Japanese concluded from Longcloth that the terrain was in fact favorable for guerrilla warfare by small bodies of crack troops, but nearly impossible to defend because the enemy couldn't be pinned down and engaged. Their answer wasn't to fortify the border. It was to stop playing defense entirely and strike first, before the British could use that same terrain against them again on a larger scale. Mutaguchi had been, or in the words of multiple post-war historical assessments, quite literally goaded by the first Chindit expedition. He'd watched an enemy force cross ground he'd sworn was uncrossable, and it convinced him, wrongly, as it turned out, that a full Japanese division could do something similar in reverse. Straight into India, on March 8, 1944, Operation Yugo began. 3 Japanese divisions, the 15th, 31st and 33rd, pushed toward Imphal and Kohima. It would become one of the largest and most catastrophic defeats in the history of the Imperial Japanese Army. The sieges dragged into April, May and June, through monsoon rains that turned mountain roads into mud rivers, while Japanese supply lines, already stretched far beyond what Mutaguchi's own staff had warned him was sustainable, simply collapsed. Roughly 2/3 of the Japanese Army's transport horses and mules died on the approach march alone. And running through the middle of that collapse was the second Chindit expedition, Operation Thursday, launched in March 1944, this time nearly 20,000 men strong, flown directly into the Burmese jungle by American and British aircraft, rather than marching in on foot. In late June 1944, Brigadier Mike Calvert's 77th Brigade, veterans of the first expedition, commanding the second, cut the Japanese rail line supplying the front, first holding an entrenched position nicknamed White City, then storming the town of Mogaung against a larger Japanese garrison in brutal, close-quarters fighting. With Mogaung lost, Japanese forces further north at Myetkina were cut off entirely. By July 1944, Mutaguchi's invasion of India had failed completely. Japanese casualties at Imphal and Kohima are estimated at over 50,000 men, the worst defeat suffered by the Japanese army up to that point in the war, and one from which Japan's position in Burma never recovered. Senior Japanese officers, Mutaguchi included, later stated plainly that the Chindits of the second expedition had drawn off divisions Japan urgently needed at Imphal and Kohima, and that this diversion tipped the balance of the entire campaign against them. So the full, honest arc of this story isn't a single battle where Japanese soldiers panicked at the sight of British troops. First, stranger and more consequential than that. Failed 3-month raid in 1943, one that cost the Chindits nearly 1/3 of their men, convinced a Japanese general that a mountain range was crossable when it wasn't supposed to be. That conviction helped launch an invasion that became Japan's worst land defeat of the war. And the same unit that planted that idea in Mutaguchi's mind came back a year later and helped make sure the invasion collapsed. Orde Wingate never saw the outcome. He was killed in a plane crash in the hills of Assam on March 24, 1944, exactly 1 year to the day after he'd ordered the first expedition's withdrawal in 1943. Before Imphal, before Kohima, before Mogaung, before any of it was decided, An idea that most of the British Army doubted, built by a brigadier many of his own peers found difficult to work with, ended up reshaping the entire Burma campaign. Not because it won a single decisive battle, but because of what it convinced the enemy was possible, and what that conviction cost them in the end. A story like this, the real chain of decisions behind the headlines, is what keeps you coming back. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from, and whether anyone in your family served in it. I read everyone from, and it shapes exactly what gets researched next.